I helped my dad pay off his mortgage, but now my stepmom wants me to fund her daughter's destination wedding, and she's telling the family I'm ungrateful. Brandon here, 28 years old, and 6 months ago, I thought helping family meant occasional support during tough times. Turns out some people see generosity as an invitation to make you their personal ATM. My stepmom Brenda and her daughter Kayla had me figured all wrong, and when I finally put my foot down about funding their dream vacation wedding, they decided to paint me as the ungrateful stepson who forgot where he came from. Let me back up and tell you about my dad, Kevin, first. He's been my hero since my mom died of breast cancer when I was 14. Those were the darkest years of our lives, watching her fight for 3 years while the medical bills piled up like snowdrifts. Dad worked 2 jobs the entire time, his regular shift at the factory and weekend construction gigs, just to keep us afloat and maintain her treatments. He never complained once, never made me feel like our situation was hopeless, even when I knew he was surviving on maybe 4 hours of sleep a night. After Mom died, it was just Dad and me figuring out life together. He taught me everything about work ethic, responsibility, and taking care of the people you love. He also taught me about financial planning, partly because watching Mom's medical bills destroy our savings had shown us both how quickly life could spiral out of control financially. Dad drilled into me the importance of emergency funds, living below your means, and always having a backup plan. When I graduated high school, Dad pushed me toward computer science because he could see where the industry was heading. He helped me apply for every scholarship we could find and took out student loans to cover what financial aid didn't handle. He was determined that I'd have opportunities he never had access to, even if it meant sacrificing his own financial security to make it happen. I worked my tail off in college and landed a job at a tech startup right after graduation. The company went through explosive growth during my first few years there, and I was lucky enough to get stock options that became extremely valuable when we went public. By age 26, I was making more money than I'd ever imagined possible, and my first thought was how proud Mom would have been to see what Dad's sacrifices had enabled me to achieve. Dad met Brenda about 3 years ago through someone at work. She seemed nice enough when I first met her, friendly, outgoing, clearly made Dad happy after years of being alone. She worked as an office manager at a dental practice and had this 24-year-old daughter Kayla from her previous marriage. Kayla worked part-time at retail stores and still lived with Brenda and her ex-husband on and off, depending on how her finances were going at any given moment. When Dad and Brenda got married 2 years ago, I was genuinely happy for them. Dad deserved companionship and happiness after everything he'd been through, and Brenda seemed to bring out a lighter side of his personality that I hadn't seen since before Mom got sick. The wedding was small and simple, which fit Dad's practical nature and limited budget perfectly. But things started changing pretty quickly after they got married. Brenda had very different ideas about money and lifestyle than Dad did. Where he was naturally frugal and cautious about expenses, she believed in enjoying life and not worrying too much about saving for hypothetical future problems. She'd encourage Dad to take vacations he couldn't really afford, buy clothes he didn't need, eat at expensive restaurants, and generally live more lavishly than he was comfortable with. At first, these changes seemed harmless and maybe even good for Dad. He'd been so focused on survival and responsibility for so long that maybe he needed someone to help him enjoy the fruits of his labor. But I started noticing that Dad seemed stressed about money in ways he hadn't been when he was managing finances on his own, even during the really tough years after Mom died. The breaking point came last year when Dad confided in me that he was struggling to make his mortgage payments. Between Brenda's spending habits and some unexpected home repairs, he'd burned through his savings and was having trouble keeping up with all his monthly obligations. He was embarrassed to admit the financial problems and worried about potentially losing the house where I'd grown up and where all our memories of Mom were stored. I didn't hesitate to offer help. Dad had sacrificed everything for me over the years, and I was finally in a position to return some of that support. I calculated that he had about $47,000 remaining on his mortgage, and I could easily afford to pay it off without significantly impacting my own financial security. I insisted on paying the full balance as a gift, not a loan, because I wanted Dad to have the peace of mind that comes with owning your home outright. Dad was incredibly grateful and emotional about my offer. He tried to insist that it should be structured as a loan he could pay back over time, but I convinced him to accept it as a gift. I explained that his years of sacrifice for my education and well-being were worth far more than $47,000, and that I was honored to be able to help him achieve true financial stability. The mortgage payoff happened in September, and Dad was thrilled to finally own his home free and clear. He called me the day the paperwork was processed, and I could hear the relief and gratitude in his voice. He said it was the first time in years that he'd felt truly financially secure and that he couldn't believe his son was in a position to provide such an incredible gift to the family. Brenda's reaction was more complicated, though. She thanked me for helping the family, but I could sense some underlying tension about the arrangement. She made comments about how generous I was and how lucky Dad was to have such a successful son, but there was something in her tone that suggested she was already calculating what other financial assistance might be available from me. I should have paid closer attention to those warning signs, because within a month of paying off Dad's mortgage, Brenda started testing the waters for additional financial support. It began with small requests and casual comments about expenses she and Kayla were facing. She'd mentioned Kayla's student loan payments or her own car repairs, always framed as updates rather than direct requests for help. But I could see where this was heading. Brenda had witnessed my willingness and ability to solve major financial problems, and she was clearly positioning herself to take advantage of both my resources and my motivation to help family members. She discovered that I had significant income and a strong desire to support the people I loved, and she was strategically working to benefit from both of those factors. What I didn't realize at the time was that Brenda's definition of family financial support was completely different from mine. I'd helped Dad with a specific crisis that was threatening his housing security. Brenda saw my mortgage assistance as establishing a precedent that I should be available to fund whatever lifestyle improvements she thought our family deserved. The situation was about to escalate far beyond anything I'd anticipated, and Brenda was about to reveal exactly what she thought my role should be in financing her family's dreams. The first direct request came in November, about 2 months after I'd paid off Dad's mortgage. Brenda called me on a weeknight, which was unusual since we typically only spoke during family gatherings or when Dad was present for the conversation. She started by thanking me again for helping with the house and talking about how much stress relief my generosity had provided for Dad during a difficult period. Then she transitioned into the real purpose of her call. She explained that Kayla had been going through a tough time financially and emotionally after breaking up with her longtime boyfriend. She was struggling to find steady full-time work, feeling depressed about her situation, and having trouble keeping up with her monthly expenses. Brenda wondered if I might consider helping Kayla with some of her bills, particularly her student loan payments, to give her some breathing room while she got back on her feet. The specific request was for $8,000 to pay off Kayla's remaining student debt. Brenda framed it as an investment in Kayla's future stability and mental health, emphasizing how much it would mean to have that monthly payment eliminated from her tight budget. She also mentioned that it would be a huge relief for her and Dad to see Kayla become more financially independent and self-sufficient. I was uncomfortable with this request for several reasons. First, Kayla and I barely had a relationship beyond polite small talk at family gatherings. We'd maybe had a dozen real conversations since Dad and Brenda got married, and I didn't feel like we'd developed the kind of family bond that would justify major financial assistance. Second, unlike Dad's mortgage situation, this wasn't about preventing a crisis or addressing an emergency. This was about lifestyle improvement and convenience rather than genuine need. But the biggest red flag was that Brenda had approached me directly rather than involving Dad in the conversation. That suggested she understood Dad might not approve of the request, or that she was trying to leverage my sense of family obligation without giving me the chance to discuss it with him first. I told Brenda I'd need to think about it and talk with Dad before making any decisions about additional family financial assistance. Her response was immediate and telling. She asked if it was really necessary to involve Dad since he was already stressed about money and might feel guilty about asking for more help. She suggested this could be something between us that would benefit the whole family without creating additional pressure for Dad. That conversation confirmed my suspicions that Brenda was operating independently and trying to manipulate the situation to her advantage. I decided to talk with Dad directly about Brenda's request and get his perspective on whether this kind of family assistance was appropriate. When I brought it up with Dad, his reaction was surprised and somewhat uncomfortable. He said he wasn't aware that Brenda had contacted me about Kayla's student loans, and he didn't think the situation was urgent enough to warrant asking for my help. He mentioned that Kayla had been making her payments regularly and that her financial problems were more about wanting additional spending money than actual hardship. Dad also expressed concern about establishing a pattern where family members came to me with financial requests. He said he was worried that my generosity with the mortgage might create expectations that I'd be available to solve other people's money problems, and he didn't want me to feel obligated to fund every expense that came up in our extended family. When I called Brenda to politely decline helping with Kayla's student loans, her reaction was swift and negative. She said she was disappointed that I'd discussed our conversation with Dad instead of keeping it between us. She claimed that Dad had enough stress without having to worry about these family financial dynamics, and that I was creating unnecessary tension by involving him in the decision. More concerning was her suggestion that my refusal to help Kayla showed I didn't really consider her and her daughter to be part of our family. She said she'd assumed that paying off Dad's mortgage meant I was committed to supporting all of us, not just playing favorites with my biological father. The manipulation was obvious, but it was also effective at making me question my decision. Was I being selfish by helping Dad but not extending similar assistance to my stepfamily? Was I creating divisions by treating Kayla differently than I treat a biological sibling? Over the next few months, Brenda's behavior became increasingly problematic. She'd make passive-aggressive comments during family dinners about how some family members were more generous than others. She'd mention financial pressures she and Kayla were facing, always in front of Dad, clearly hoping he'd encourage me to offer assistance. She'd talk about how blessed our family was to have someone so successful, but always with an undertone suggesting that I should be doing more to help everyone achieve the same level of financial comfort. Most frustratingly, she started telling other family members and friends about my mortgage payment, but framing it in ways that made it sound like I had unlimited resources and an obligation to share them. She'd talk about how lucky our family was to have someone so financially successful, but always with implications that I should be funding other family expenses and opportunities. The situation reached a crisis point in March when Kayla announced her engagement to her new boyfriend, Trevor. I was genuinely happy for Kayla and hoped this relationship would bring her the stability and happiness she'd been looking for. But within days of the engagement announcement, Brenda called me with news that would test my patience and family loyalty to their absolute limits. Kayla and Trevor wanted a destination wedding in Hawaii, with an estimated cost of $35,000 for the ceremony, reception, and accommodation for the wedding party. Brenda explained that this was Kayla's dream wedding and a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to give her daughter the perfect start to her marriage. The problem was that neither Kayla nor Trevor could afford a destination wedding, and Brenda and her ex-husband didn't have the resources to pay for it either. Brenda wondered if I might consider helping to fund the wedding as a generous gesture that would mean everything to Kayla and demonstrate my commitment to being part of their family. She emphasized how much this would show Kayla that I truly accepted her as my sister, and how grateful the entire family would be for such an incredible wedding gift. I was absolutely speechless. After declining to help with $8,000 in student loans, Brenda was now asking for more than 4 times that amount to fund an elaborate vacation wedding that nobody involved could actually afford. This wasn't about helping family through a crisis or emergency. This was about subsidizing an expensive luxury that was completely optional. When I told Brenda I needed time to consider such a significant request, I was already certain that funding a $35,000 destination wedding was completely out of the question. But her response to my hesitation would reveal just how much she'd been counting on my money to solve her family's problems. When I discussed Brenda's wedding funding request with Dad, his reaction was immediate and negative. He was embarrassed that Brenda had asked for such an enormous amount of money and frustrated that she'd made the request without consulting him first. He said he tried to talk with Brenda about having realistic expectations regarding my financial assistance, but she dismissed his concerns and insisted that I wouldn't mind helping with something so important. Dad was particularly upset because he felt Brenda's behavior was damaging our relationship and putting him in an impossible position between his wife and his son. He didn't want to seem unsupportive of Brenda and Kayla, but he also didn't want me to feel pressured into funding lifestyle choices that weren't financially responsible for any of the people involved. I spent several days thinking about how to handle the situation diplomatically. I wanted to decline firmly, but without creating unnecessary family drama or making Dad feel caught in the middle. I decided to have an honest conversation with Brenda about my perspective on family financial assistance and my boundaries around these types of requests. When I called Brenda to explain my position, I told her that while I'd been happy to help Dad with his mortgage, that had been a specific situation involving housing security rather than lifestyle preferences. I explained that funding a destination wedding wasn't something I was comfortable with, both because of the expense and because it would set a precedent for funding major lifestyle choices rather than addressing genuine family needs. Brenda's response was immediate anger mixed with emotional manipulation. She accused me of being selfish and inconsistent, If I could afford to give Dad $47,000 for his mortgage, why couldn't I help Kayla have the wedding she'd always dreamed of? She said Kayla had been counting on my help and would be devastated to learn that I didn't care enough about her happiness to contribute to her special day. Most manipulatively, Brenda suggested that my refusal proved I didn't really accept her and Kayla as family. She said a real family member would want to help create beautiful memories and show support for important life events. She claimed that Dad was disappointed in my attitude, though I knew that wasn't true based on our previous conversations about this exact situation. When I continued to decline her request, Brenda escalated her tactics dramatically. She started calling other family members to complain about my selfishness and lack of family loyalty. She contacted my dad's siblings, telling them about the mortgage payment but framing my refusal to fund the wedding as evidence that I was playing favorites and didn't really care about my stepfamily. The version of events Brenda shared with extended family was carefully crafted to make me look bad while making her seem reasonable. She emphasized how much I'd spent on Dad's mortgage while minimizing the fact that it had been necessary to prevent him from losing his house. She portrayed the wedding funding as a small request compared to what I'd already given, completely ignoring the fact that a destination wedding was a luxury rather than a necessity. Most damagingly, Brenda started spreading the narrative that I was ungrateful for everything Dad had done for me over the years. She suggested that refusing to help with the wedding showed I'd forgotten my father's sacrifices and was being stingy now that I had financial success. She implied that a truly grateful son would want to contribute to family celebrations and milestone events, regardless of the cost involved. The family gossip and pressure campaign was more stressful than I'd anticipated. Dad's sister called to ask about the situation, clearly having received a very one-sided version of events from Brenda. Several family members seemed to believe that I should be more generous with my resources, especially given how much Dad had helped me achieve my education and career success. The worst part was seeing how this situation was affecting Dad. He was caught between supporting his wife and protecting his son from unreasonable demands. He tried to mediate the conflict by having private conversations with both Brenda and me, but her public campaign had created family-wide tension that couldn't be easily resolved through diplomatic discussions. In May, the situation reached its breaking point during a family barbecue at Dad and Brenda's house. Extended family members were present, including some who had clearly been influenced by Brenda's version of events about my supposed selfishness and ingratitude. The atmosphere was tense from the moment I arrived, with several people giving me cool greetings or avoiding conversation entirely. During dinner, Brenda made several pointed comments about family loyalty and supporting each other through important life events. She talked about how meaningful it was when family members made sacrifices to help create special memories, clearly referencing the wedding funding issue without addressing it directly in front of everyone. Finally, Kayla herself approached me about the wedding during the dessert course. She'd obviously been coached by Brenda about how to frame the request, emphasizing how much it would mean to have my support and how grateful she'd be for any contribution I could make toward their dream wedding. She mentioned that they'd already made some deposits based on the assumption that family would help with the costs, which made my refusal seem like a sudden betrayal rather than a consistent boundary. I realized that Brenda had been telling Kayla that I would likely contribute to the wedding fund, setting up expectations that made my decline seem cruel and unexpected. Kayla seemed genuinely surprised and hurt when I explained that I wouldn't be able to help fund a destination wedding, clearly not understanding that this was an ongoing conversation rather than a new decision. The conversation quickly became uncomfortable as other family members overheard and began weighing in with their opinions about family obligations and financial support. Some people supported my position that a destination wedding was an optional luxury, while others suggested that family members should help each other celebrate important milestones regardless of the cost involved. But the most painful moment came when Brenda stood up in front of everyone and delivered what felt like a prepared speech about family values and gratitude. She talked about how Dad had sacrificed everything to give me opportunities for success, and how disappointing it was to see that generosity hadn't been repaid with a willingness to help other family members achieve their dreams. She said she'd expected that someone who'd been blessed with financial success would want to share those blessings with family, especially for something as important as a wedding. She implied that my refusal to help was selfish and showed that I'd lost sight of the values Dad had tried to teach me about taking care of the people you love. The public confrontation was humiliating and manipulative, but it also clarified exactly what I was dealing with. Brenda wasn't interested in reasonable boundaries or mutual respect. She wanted access to my money and was willing to use emotional manipulation and family pressure to get it. Looking around that backyard at family members who were judging me based on Brenda's selective storytelling, I realized I needed to set the record straight once and for all. It was time to address this situation directly and establish clear boundaries that couldn't be ignored or manipulated. I stood up in front of the entire family gathering and asked for everyone's attention. I said I wanted to address the wedding funding issue directly since it had clearly become a source of family tension and misunderstanding. I could see Brenda's face go pale as she realized I wasn't going to let her narrative go unchallenged in front of all these people. I started by explaining the context of Dad's mortgage situation in detail. I described how he'd sacrificed his own financial security to pay for Mom's medical bills and my education, and how he'd been struggling to keep up with mortgage payments due to unexpected expenses and lifestyle changes after his marriage to Brenda. I emphasized that paying off the mortgage had been about preventing Dad from losing his home, not about establishing myself as the family's permanent financial solution for every expense that came up. Then I addressed the wedding funding request directly and honestly. I explained that a $35,000 destination wedding was a luxury choice, not a necessity, and that my declining to fund it was about maintaining reasonable boundaries rather than lacking generosity or family loyalty. I pointed out that most people plan weddings based on what they can afford themselves, not what they hope family members will pay for on their behalf. I also revealed Brenda's pattern of financial requests and manipulation tactics over the past year. I described how she'd approached me directly about Kayla's student loans without involving Dad, and how she'd framed my mortgage assistance as proof that I should be available to fund other family expenses and lifestyle improvements. I explained that she'd been telling people I was ungrateful and selfish for declining to pay for lifestyle choices I'd never been consulted about in the first place. The family members who had been judging me based on Brenda's version of events began to look uncomfortable as they realized they'd been given incomplete and misleading information about the situation. Several of Dad's siblings nodded in understanding, clearly recognizing the manipulation tactics I was describing from their own experiences with difficult family dynamics. But I wasn't finished setting the record straight. I pulled out my phone and showed the family my bank records documenting not just the mortgage payment, but also several other instances where I'd quietly helped family members over the years without making a big show of my generosity. I'd paid for Dad's car repairs, covered emergency medical expenses for my grandfather, and contributed to various family needs without expecting recognition or creating obligations for future support. I explained that the difference between those situations and the wedding request was that previous assistance had addressed genuine needs rather than funding optional luxuries. I'd never expected gratitude or recognition for that help, but I also didn't think it obligated me to fund every expensive wish that came up in the future. Then I addressed the ungrateful accusation directly and emotionally. I talked about how much Dad's sacrifices had meant to me and how they'd motivated me to work hard and build financial success that could benefit our family when genuine needs arose. I explained that my gratitude was expressed through maintaining a close relationship with Dad, supporting him when he truly needed help, and trying to honor the values he'd taught me about responsibility and integrity. I said that according to Dad's values, being grateful didn't mean saying yes to every financial request or funding lifestyle choices people couldn't afford on their own. It meant being thoughtful about how I used my resources and making sure my generosity was directed toward genuine needs rather than optional luxuries that created ongoing expectations for support. The most important part of my response was addressing Brenda directly about her manipulation tactics and unrealistic expectations. I told her that I respected her love for her daughter and her desire to give Kayla a beautiful wedding celebration. But I explained that manipulating family relationships and spreading false narratives about my character wasn't an acceptable way to pursue financial assistance from anyone. I said that if she wanted to discuss family financial matters in the future, those conversations needed to include Dad and be based on honest communication rather than emotional manipulation and public pressure campaigns. I also made it clear that attempts to turn family members against each other would only result in less willingness to help with anything, not more cooperation. Finally, I offered a compromise that demonstrated my actual values regarding family support while maintaining appropriate boundaries. I said I'd be happy to contribute $2,000 toward Kayla's wedding as a generous but reasonable gift. That amount would show my support for her marriage without funding the entire expensive destination celebration that she and Trevor couldn't afford on their own. The response from the family was immediate and supportive. Dad looked relieved that I'd addressed the situation directly and established clear boundaries that couldn't be misinterpreted. Several family members apologized for judging me based on incomplete information and praised my offer to contribute a reasonable amount to the wedding while maintaining healthy financial boundaries. Most satisfying was seeing Brenda realize that her manipulation campaign had completely backfired. Instead of pressuring me into funding the entire wedding, she'd exposed her own tactics and damaged her credibility with the extended family. Several people approached me privately after my speech to say they'd been uncomfortable with the pressure she'd been applying, but hadn't known how to address it appropriately. Kayla accepted my offer to contribute $2,000 to her wedding fund and seemed to understand that this was a generous gift rather than an obligation I owed her. She and Trevor ultimately planned a local wedding that cost about $8,000 total, and it turned out to be a beautiful celebration that everyone could actually afford to attend and enjoy. The aftermath of that family confrontation led to significant changes in our household dynamics. Brenda stopped making indirect requests for financial assistance and began treating me with more respect and appropriate boundaries. She seemed to understand that attempting to manipulate me through family pressure would only damage her own relationships and reputation rather than achieving her financial goals. Dad was grateful that I'd addressed the situation directly rather than letting the tension continue to build and damage our family relationships. He apologized for not shutting down Brenda's behavior sooner and promised to be more involved in any future discussions about family financial matters to prevent similar manipulation attempts. More importantly, the extended family gained a clearer understanding of my approach to helping relatives and supporting family members when genuine needs arose. They saw that I was generous when there were real emergencies or important needs, but that I maintained reasonable boundaries around lifestyle funding and luxury expenses that people should handle themselves. 6 months later, our family relationships have stabilized in a much healthier pattern that respects everyone's boundaries and expectations. I continue to help Dad with occasional expenses and emergency situations, but always as part of conversations that include him directly rather than through intermediaries with hidden agendas. Brenda has stopped positioning herself as a spokesperson for family financial requests and seems to understand that respect and honesty are prerequisites for any assistance. The experience taught me valuable lessons about the difference between helping family and enabling unrealistic expectations, and the importance of addressing manipulation directly rather than hoping it will resolve itself through private conversations. Most importantly, I learned that true gratitude isn't demonstrated by saying yes to every request or funding every expense that comes up. It's about maintaining the values and integrity that made generosity possible in the first place, and ensuring that family support strengthens relationships rather than creating ongoing obligations and resentment. Dad had taught me to work hard, be responsible with money, and help others when they genuinely needed support. Funding a destination wedding wouldn't have honored those lessons. Setting appropriate boundaries and expecting honesty from family members absolutely did.